Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure. The transport vessel decoupled with a hiss that faded into vacuum silence. Cirrus Station loomed ahead, an immense lattice of bioluminescent curves and steel ribs orbiting the viridian swirl of Varin below. It pulsed with quiet life, neither fully human nor wholly alien, a testament to a fragile dream where enemies had once traded missiles, not greetings. Callen Rhys stepped from the docking arm into a corridor that shimmered like living glass. The walls responded to movement with subtle light gradients, Velari design elegant and unnervingly precise. Above him, banners of the United Terran Accord and Velari High Council twisted in the artificial breeze, their unity ceremonial but strained. He walked slowly, his breath shallow. Not from fear, from gravity. The station's artificial pull was lighter than Earth's, just enough to remind him this wasn't home. It never would be. Still, as the doors sealed behind him and the hum of translated voices filtered in, Callen allowed himself one quiet thought. Maybe peace wasn't a lie after all. He had once been called a surgeon of the soul, capable of dissecting emotion without ever bleeding. To those who admired him, Callen Rhys was the mind behind the method, a xenopsychologist with an uncanny ability to map alien cognition without interference, untouched and untouchable. But brilliance often cast long shadows. In sterile academic halls he had earned tenure with clinical detachment. Love to him was a concept, documented, categorized, shelved. His former partners had said he was present but never reachable, like a man standing behind glass. They whispered of emotional absence, of connection never quite made. But it wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Emotion, when touched too directly, threatened to overwhelm. So he built walls, made of research, discipline, distance. Behind them, he was safe, controlled, alone. That was why he had been chosen. A man immune to the pull of alien affect. A man who would never cross the line. The only problem was, Callen didn't know if the line was real anymore, or if he'd already stepped over it. They moved like light refracted through water, tall beings of shimmering translucence, skin that rippled with soft internal glows, never still and never quite solid. The Velari spoke no words. They pulsed. Emotion through biochemical fields, a silent language of scent, color, and rhythm. Thought was scent, meaning was temperature, emotion was light, and touch was chaos. An unfiltered scream to their minds. To them, humans were kinetic storms, loud, volatile, endlessly expressive. The Velari prized emotional harmony like oxygen. Humanity's insistence on skin-to-skin contact, facial expressions, and clumsy hugs made them seem barely evolved, primitives crashing into a cathedral of stillness. Ae'laa Thyn shimmered like no other Velari. Her emotional fields didn't flow in clean, curated waves. They fractured, flared, pulsed unpredictably. Where her kin walked in calculated serenity, she drifted closer to the edge of feeling. She stood closer to humans than she should have. She stared longer. When she listened, her eyes didn't shimmer indifferently. They searched. Assigned to the empathy exchange program, Ae'laa was technically a liaison, an observer of human emotional dynamics. But she did more than observe. She felt in ways Velari weren't supposed to. Other Velari noticed the variance. Her field patterns twisted into unclassified structures whenever she interacted with Callen. Whispers began, quiet flickers of concern through communal links. But Ae'laa didn't pull away. She leaned in, fascinated by the dissonance in him. She wasn't repelled by his emotional noise. She was drawn to it, like a moth to a bonfire. The neural simulator faltered mid-sequence. A pulse of static surged through the chamber, and Aelaa's tethered emotional field cracked like glass under pressure. The chair's restraints failed. Her body convulsed, lights within her skin flickering in jagged patterns. Chaos rippled outward. Panic, pain, confusion. Callen didn't think. He moved. His hand closed around hers. She gasped. Not in fear, not in pain. The world went still. Her neural field, spiking with overload, suddenly stabilized. The simulation collapsed around them, systems resetting in silence. And Ae'laa, trembling, confused, lifted her gaze. For the first time, her mouth curved upward, uncertain, astonished. She smiled. For a Velari, touch should have triggered neurological collapse. It should have seared her mind like a scream at full volume. Instead, It lit a signal no one had seen in generations. Something had changed. Something ancient, buried deep in forgotten genes, flickered to life. Behind closed doors, beneath dimmed lights and sound-dampened walls, Ae'laa spoke in a whisper of color and tone that vibrated with unsteady resonance. She didn't flinch from the memory. She reached for it. That moment, that contact had not burned her. It had illuminated her. The sensation wasn't pain. It was something far more dangerous. Pleasure. Her neural field, once smooth and stable, now fluttered like a signal seeking meaning. To her people, such instability meant corruption. To her, it meant awakening. She confessed that the touch had felt right, in a way nothing else ever had. It had shaken something loose inside her, something forgotten. She began to ask questions. No Velari had asked in generations. What did it mean to desire, to crave? Why was the memory of warmth more powerful than any recorded emotion? Callen had touched her once, and now, without understanding why, she wanted him to do it again. The official report labeled it reflexive emergency contact, a one-time incident, clinically unfortunate but inconsequential. But Callen knew better. He reviewed the logs obsessively, frame by frame, data spike by data spike. Her neural emissions didn't show distress, they showed euphoria. Her field had synced with his bioelectric rhythm for a brief moment. Two different species, two incompatible systems, and yet something had aligned. She returned to his quarters unannounced 2 days later. No excuse, no protocol, just presence. And she asked questions again, not just about emotion, about him, his thoughts, his reactions, his past. She lingered near his chair, eyes glowing faintly, fingers occasionally brushing fabric without contact. Almost. Callen began documenting it under the guise of scientific observation. But each note he wrote felt less like research and more like confession. She wasn't just responding to the accident, she was chasing it. And something in him, something long buried, began wondering what would happen if he didn't run. The door chimed once, softly. Too softly for a Velari. Callen paused mid-sentence, stylus hovering above his datapad. It was late, beyond formal working hours, and no scheduled meetings marked his log. Velari did not make social calls, not to humans, not without reason. When he opened the door, Ae'laa stood there, still, composed, but something in her glow pulsed wrong. Her internal bioluminescence stuttered in half-formed pulses, neither warning nor welcome, just uncertainty. She stepped forward uninvited, crossed the threshold like someone breaking ancient law. No escort, no translator drone, just her, alone. She said she wanted to talk about affection, proximity, human desire, but her eyes said more. Her gaze lingered on his hands, on the spaces between them. She asked what it meant to miss someone, physically. To yearn for closeness not out of need but out of want. Callen gave her logical answers. Theories. She didn't want theories. She wanted to stay. What does it feel like to be loved? Ae'laa asked the question like it was dangerous, like the words themselves might fracture something sacred. To her kind, emotions were collective, refined and broadcast in gentle waves. Love was not singular, it was social resonance. But humans compressed all that into one fragile body, one reckless heart. She didn't understand how a species could survive with feelings that sharp, that personal. Her kind diffused pain, grief and joy alike into the ether of shared thought, but humans held on to it. They let it hurt. They wanted it to hurt, because that meant it mattered. She asked if longing always hurt, like hunger. If closeness could feel like burning. If Callen had ever wanted to hold someone so badly it made him ache. He didn't answer right away. He remembered hands he hadn't touched in years, faces blurred by time, not indifference. He remembered choosing study over connection, safety over pain. Ae'laa stepped closer, just near enough for warmth. She didn't need a definition. She had seen the truth in his hesitation. This time she asked for it. No chaos, no malfunction, no falling equipment or emergencies to mask it, just a question. Ae'laa stood before him, hands open, not as a test, but an invitation. She said she wanted to understand the spark, not from memory, from experience. Callen hesitated. Every protocol screamed against it. The previous contact had triggered spikes in her neurotransmitter emissions, enough to justify medical quarantine. But this wasn't science anymore. This was choice. He reached out, slowly, deliberately. Their hands met, skin to skin, her entire frame lit up in radiant arcs, colors that had no name in any Terran spectrum. Her pupils dilated, breath caught. But there was no pain, no neural collapse, only a trembling gasp and a single word she barely managed to form. Again. He let go first. She staggered back a half step, overwhelmed but not afraid. Her field flared in chaotic beauty, flashes of emotion no Velari had dared express in generations. In that moment, Callen knew, this was not an isolated reaction. This was the beginning of something deeper, something neither of them truly understood. And, whatever this spark was, it had now taken root in them both. They saw it in her walk first. The sway, too fluid. The delay between footfalls, too deliberate. Then in her light. Her internal glow fractured from its usual rhythm into spirals that flickered unpredictably. Emotional variance, they called it. Aberration. She called it freedom. The Velari Council summoned her. Her neural scans were displayed across translucent panes, peaks where there should have been plateaus. She stood silent as the judgment came. The human had infected her. His touch had imprinted chaos across her empathy field. She didn't protest. She asked a question instead. What if the chaos was older than the silence? They did not answer, only decreed separation. She was no longer fit for diplomatic service. Her contact privileges were revoked. Her sessions terminated, but Ae'laa didn't stop. Behind closed walls, she searched for old records, ancient data fragments scrubbed from the common cores. She stared at Callen's fingerprints like symbols of a lost dialect, and somewhere beneath the weight of her exile, she smiled again, because now she knew. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a memory, trying to resurface. He told himself it was still research. Each night he sat at his console, recording her emotional fluctuations, cataloging her eye patterns, logging the cadence of her speech. Her laughter had become irregular, an involuntary byproduct of contact, he reasoned. The tremble in her voice, mere signal interference, all of it had explanations, but not the way she said his name, not the way his hand hovered above hers long. After the scanner shut down, he found himself deleting entries, not errors, edits. Redacted lines where feeling had eclipsed fact. He stopped reporting her visits. He stopped asking why she kept coming. He started asking why he wanted her to. Her Iki. Image lingered on every reflective surface. Her voice echoed between data points. He measured her not as a subject but as a presence. He was supposed to be the control in the experiment, but somewhere in the silence between entries, the observer became the variable, and as her light flickered across his walls, Callen began to fear he'd already crossed a line no equation could quantify. It began as whispers between the translators, barely audible flickers in the station's emotional undercurrent. The liaison's field was unstable. The human had touched her more than once, not by accident. Then came the questions, muted inquiries from the Velari Guard, hushed speculation from Terran staff, reports circulated, protocols re-evaluated. Was it intimacy? Was it influence? Was the human coercing her, or worse, altering her neural matrix? Neither Ae'laa nor Callen spoke of it openly, but everyone could see it now. She moved differently near him. Her patterns bent toward his presence. The air shimmered when they passed each other. Others began avoiding her, some out of fear, others shame. The quiet reverence once given to a senior liaison faded into wary distance. Still, Ae'laa never recoiled, because for the first time in her life, she was feeling, not just reflecting, and that to her was worth the exile. She stood in the center of his quarters, lit only by the pulse of distant stars. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. She told him the craving hadn't stopped. It had evolved, no longer a surge of uncontrollable need, but something more precise, sharper, directed. Her neural field had adapted, not dampened, not numbed, tuned. Callen watched her, heart heavy with conflict. This wasn't a dependency. It wasn't addiction. It was awakening. And he had been the match that lit it. She didn't beg for touch. She didn't reach out. She simply looked at him and said, "It's not you I want, it's what you opened." The words hit harder than any plea. She wasn't under his influence. She was choosing the flame. He stepped forward, uncertain. This time she did not ask. She touched him. and for a moment, the room burned with light only the two of them could see. Her neural scans lit up like a storm front, non-linear feedback loops firing in rapid succession, chemical reward pathways surging far beyond normative thresholds. The data streamed across, Callen's screen in a wash of numbers that shouldn't exist. She wasn't experiencing touch as contact. She was experiencing it as transcendence. Ae'laa sat across from him, still trembling from the most recent session. Her glow had shifted into unfamiliar spectrums, bands of golden violet and heat-pulsed silver that pulsed not with distress, but with something almost joyful. What terrified him wasn't the anomaly, it was the consistency. Each interaction, no matter how small, a brushed shoulder, a graze of fingertips, triggered the same cascade. Not diminishing over time, intensifying, compounding, and only with him. She tested others at his urging. No response, no spark. Her field remained inert unless he made contact. She confessed that the feeling came in waves. Pleasure, yes, but also clarity. She claimed she could think more fully, that her emotions, long veiled and distributed, had coalesced into something sharp and hers. It wasn't corruption, it was individuation. Callen stared at the screen, at data no one would believe. If this was addiction, it was more complex than any human vice, and if it wasn't, then something older than protocol had just rewritten the rules. She tried to replicate it. Within her quarters, Ae'laa constructed synthetic analogues of Terran epidermis, layered polymers with microfluidic channels, calibrated to mimic warmth, texture, and resistance. The scans were perfect, the chemistry matched, but when her fingers pressed against the material, nothing happened. Her neural field didn't even flicker. She grew desperate. Version after version failed. She adjusted scent dispersal, tuned electromagnetic feedback, even infused samples with her own pheromonal traces, still nothing. Then came the breakdown. Callen found her slumped against the console, surrounded by failed skin. Her bioluminescence had dimmed to barely a pulse. Her emotional field was silent, not flat, but hollow. She whispered that the touch had never just been about nerves. It had been him. The intention, the soul behind the contact, the unpredictable storm of a human mind reaching toward her without demand or design. What she had built was simulacra, but her body had learned the difference between flesh and connection, and now it starved. She wasn't trying to mimic contact anymore. She was trying to self-dose, and even Callen, with all his training, couldn't pretend that didn't terrify him, because what if this wasn't just a shift in behavior? What if it was the first tremor of a species-level mutation? The summons arrived encoded in radiant glyphs, shimmering across Callen's interface like a living reprimand. It bore the crest of the Velari High Council, 3 interlocking spirals, now flashing red. Ae'laa stood with him at the chamber's edge as they entered the council atrium, a gravity-neutral sphere of floating light points and scent-encoded verdicts. The air was thick with disapproval, more emotion than oxygen. The eldest among them addressed her not by name but designation. They cited her scans, her disrupted empathy field, her volatile light patterns, her defiance of species protocols. She was a vector now, an aberration, a threat to Velari stability. Her response was calm. She asked them when they had last felt something that wasn't filtered through communal restraint. They answered by invoking Emergency Clause Zeta 11. No further contact with the human. Callen would be removed from the station immediately. She was to be reset, her neural field restored to pre-contact parameters through ritual restoration. A soft term for what amounted to a psychic purge. Callen spoke then. Not as a researcher, not as a diplomat, as a man. He told them this was not addiction but emergence, a waking memory, and they could either help her manage it or bury it and lose everything she might become. The council recessed without comment. Ae'laa didn't cry, but her glow dimmed just enough to show that something inside her had already broken, and for the first time since meeting her, Callen wanted to scream. He told himself it was concern, professional responsibility, the moral obligation of the scientist to his subject. That's what he repeated in his head over and over as he stood outside her quarters, waiting for the soft signal of her approach. But it wasn't concern. Not anymore. He'd grown used to her presence, the cadence of her voice, the shimmer of her emotional field when she laughed, the way her gaze didn't just observe him but seemed to see him. Entirely, uncomfortably, completely. He started rearranging his hours to match hers. Found excuses to pass her workstation. He began recording audio logs not just of her field readings, but of their conversations. Her questions lingered long after she'd gone, and in those moments of silence, he realized something had shifted. She looked at him like he was more than himself, like he was the only tether she had to reality. And part of him, ashamed, quiet but real, liked it. He wasn't her handler, he was her anchor, and if she fell now, she'd take part of him with her. They called it a containment proposal, a plan drafted by the joint Terran-Velari Ethics Council to treat Ae'laa's condition as an emergent medical phenomenon. She'd be placed in a monitored chamber, sensory exposure limited, neural dampeners administered to suppress pleasure response pathways. Controlled withdrawal, a clinical detox. Callen read the draft once, then set it on fire. What they didn't understand, what they refused to admit, was that Ae'laa had already passed the threshold. This wasn't a reflex arc they could sever, or a trauma loop they could mute. This was identity. Suppress it and they wouldn't just erase the addiction, they'd erase her. He stood before the oversight board and said it plainly. You're not treating a neural disease. You're dismantling a person. The room was silent. The silence of policy, of protocol, of people more afraid of change than they were of extinction. But a voice broke through. Callen Rhys, a Velari neuroarchaeologist and field theorist, stood and activated an old visual, a Velari embryo with dormant neural clusters highlighted in blue. Ae'laa's new neural pattern matched them. This isn't dysfunction, Rhys said, it's reactivation. The room erupted in argument. The humans didn't want to interfere. The Velari feared social collapse, but Callen saw something deeper in Ae'laa's eyes. Not fear, conviction. She wasn't asking to be saved, she was asking to be heard. The data shouldn't have existed. Early Velari fossils, biopreserved in the mineral folds of pre-symbiotic planes, carried neural networks once dismissed as evolutionary scaffolding, useless residue, leftovers from before the Great Silencing. But Callen Rhys had spent a lifetime on anomalies, and Ae'laa was the anomaly that made everything fit. She matched patterns that hadn't appeared in recorded Velari evolution for over 10 millennia, not only in her neural fields, but in her protein expressions, microglial responses. Even the energy signature of her emotional emissions had shifted, no longer smooth and ambient, but focused, directional, personal. What Ae'laa had become wasn't a fluke, it was a prototype, a message encoded into biology and buried under millennia of cultural suppression. She wasn't just evolving, she was remembering, and if she could remember, others could too. The Velari had prided themselves on emotional harmony. But what if that harmony came at the cost of their truth? What if the silence they embraced wasn't peace, but amnesia? Callen stared at the raw scan overlays, layered against Velari history like blood on a faded map. Ae'laa was no longer a diplomatic incident. She was a fork in the evolutionary road, and every step she took forward might fracture the species behind her. She spoke of him in ways that unsettled him, not as a colleague, not even as a partner, but as a locus. Her fixed point around which her world now rotated. When she described her thoughts, they always spiraled back to him. When she dreamed, it was always of touch. Not sensation alone, but the act. The giving, the receiving, the trust. Callen watched. Her sleep once, silent in the half-dark of her recovery chamber. Her glow pulsed softly beneath translucent skin, patterns drifting with breath. He wondered what it felt like to be someone's axis. Someone's storm and stillness. He feared it. She said she wasn't addicted to him. She was addicted to the spark. The thing he unlocked. But what if there was no line between the two? He no longer knew if she saw him. The flawed, silent, broken man behind the profession, or if she saw the symbol he had become. The myth. And worse, he didn't know which one he wanted her to believe in, because part of him, the part he buried beneath data, reports, and training, wanted to be that myth, even if it cost them both their truths. It began with silence, not the gentle, humming stillness of the Velari meditation chambers, but a choking, hollow silence that stripped away meaning. Ae'laa's empathic field no longer shimmered. It pulsed erratically, flashing between panic and vacancy. Her light dimmed, Her pupils lost focus. 3 days without contact, 72 hours without skin. Her body remained intact. Her mind did not. She stopped eating. Her speech slurred. Not from physiological decline, but from emotional dissociation, memories drifting loose from the neural lattice that once held them. When she tried to speak, she stuttered between languages, between selves. Callen visited under the guise of medical assessment. But it wasn't assessment, it was confession. He couldn't bear to see her like this. Couldn't explain how someone so strong could fracture so completely. She begged for contact, whispered it, pleaded for his hand just for a second, said the world felt too thin without him in it. But Callen hesitated. He had become the drug. He knew that now. And no matter how much he cared, no matter how much he wanted to give her that spark again, he didn't know if doing so would save her, or destroy what remained of her identity. So he stayed, but he didn't reach out. And when she wept, her tears shimmered like light breaking against the edge of a shattered sky. He stood before the Terran delegation, jaw clenched, heart beating like thunder trapped in bone. They called it dependency. They labeled Ae'laa a neural casualty of cross-species contamination. One of them even used the word possessed. Callen stared at the table of scientists, diplomats, and administrators, each more concerned with optics than truth. She's not addicted, he said. She's evolving. But what did that even mean? Ae'laa no longer responded to Velari social fields. Her emotional output was tuned to him, to his presence, his proximity. She was rewriting her biology around a single human vector. And whether that meant ascension or collapse, he didn't know anymore. He questioned his own intentions. Was he protecting her or protecting the idea of her? The thought that something greater had chosen him to be its trigger point? And if this was evolution, then what was his role in it? Midway through the session, he paused and asked the question out loud. "Are we drug dealers," he said, voice low, "or diplomats?" The room fell silent. No one had an answer. The council didn't. Blink. Her case had moved beyond diplomacy, beyond science. It was now a matter of cultural survival. Restoration, they called it. A sacred rite designed to cleanse Velari minds of harmful excess, especially excess born from unnatural contact. What they meant was simple: lobotomy by memory erasure. Strip the neural pathways that linked emotion to identity. Reset her to pre-Callen. Calibration. Ae'laa sat quietly as the verdict was passed. No arguments, no tears. She understood what was being taken. She didn't beg. She smiled, not from defiance. Not from madness, but from something far more dangerous: certainty. Because even if they purged her, even if they wiped every trace of him from her mind, they would not erase the signal. The resonance had already begun, rippling through her genome, through fields and echoes and instinct. It would live on in others, in whispers, in flickers of need buried deep in neural bone. Callen demanded a stay, pleaded for time, evidence, a hearing. They denied him. Security drones arrived to escort her to isolation. That's when he made his decision, the line between diplomat and lover, between scientist and zealot. He crossed it with one thought: I will not let them erase her. The lights dimmed across Sector 7 as the power reroute hit, just as planned. By the time the council realized the override was internal, Ae'laa's chamber was empty, her neural signature masked, her signal field cut. Callen didn't look back. They moved through silent halls and gravity wells, the hum of the Velari skimmer vibrating beneath their feet. A stolen clearance code, a borrowed flight vector, and 3 seconds of orbital gap. That's all they needed. They plunged into Thavarin's atmosphere like fugitives wrapped in firelight. The red moon rose as they descended, a massive, rust-colored sentinel glowing against the jungle haze. Beneath it, ruins older than the Velari language itself stretched like broken ribs across a crater basin. Ae'laa said nothing during the descent. She didn't need to. Her light pulsed with memory, not fear. She knew this place. Callen landed the skimmer on a moss-veined stone platform. The air smelled like ash and life. She stepped out first. She didn't hesitate. And for the first time since the spark, Callen realized he wasn't the one leading her. She was walking towards something older than both of them, something buried in the bones of her people, and now in hers. The ruins pulsed faintly beneath the soil, resonant structures encoded with neural keys. The deeper they went, the stronger the hum became. Not a sound, not exactly, a vibration in the bones, a memory not their own. Ae'laa led him through a shattered archway, her light dimming to match the flicker of the glyphs underfoot. Symbols danced like fireflies trapped in stone, waiting, reacting. At the center stood an altar, not one of sacrifice but of union. Twin spirals carved into obsidian, one wide and open, the other tight and linear. She touched it with trembling fingers, the thaw. Air shifted. Callen felt it first, like a rush of thought not his own, a sense of touch too vast for skin alone. Emotions braided across species, time, memory, not random, designed. The altar glowed, a projection emerged, not of words but feeling, a record of ancient Velari standing together, hands linked. Physical. Contact as ritual, as identity. They had touched once, before the silence. Ae'laa turned to him, eyes wide with awe. The glyphs on her skin flared. Her neural field pulsed in harmony with the altar. They hadn't evolved into silence. They had been conditioned into it. The archive expanded, light flooding the chamber, folding reality into living memory. They saw it all. Velari, who once danced. Through fields of firelight, joined by hand and scent and song. Generations before the harmonization, the cultural event that stripped their species of physical connection and buried emotion under protocol. They had not always been quiet. They had chosen quiet. Ae'laa trembled beneath the flood of history. This wasn't discovery, it was confirmation. The spark wasn't new, it was old, an echo reawakened by contact, by proximity, by him. The code was not broken. It had been waiting. Callen looked at her, no longer a subject, no longer a symbol. She was legacy and future. She had not fallen. She had risen. The altar pulsed one final time, branding the glyphs into her skin permanently. Outside, the sky shifted. The High Council's dropships arrived in formation. They had come to retrieve the anomaly, but what they would find wasn't a rogue diplomat or an unstable vector. They would find a living record, proof that what they feared wasn't corruption. It was remembrance. The Council's dropships hissed open, fanning out across the ancient ruins with precision born from centuries of unchallenged authority. Velari enforcers emerged in ceremonial armor, silent, silver, impassive. Their empathy fields were dampened, weaponized into emotionless compliance. They expected resistance. What they found was light. Ae'laa stood before the altar, her neural field blazing with ancestral resonance. The ancient glyphs mirrored her. Pulse, living proof encoded in luminous flesh. The enforcers froze, their fields wavered, some blinked, visibly rattled. One dropped to a knee, eyes wide in unprocessed recognition. Then the archive activated. The projection rose again, Velari embracing, touching, becoming. Not infected, not broken, whole. Whispers passed between the enforcers, sharp, dissonant. Some recoiled. Others stared at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The High Councillor stepped forward, cloaked in the icy glow of tradition. She reached out, not to Ae'laa, but to the altar. The code rejected her. Ae'laa's light pulsed. Once, gently. A whisper of power, of proof. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a return. Callen stood beside her, unspeaking. He didn't have to speak, because this moment wasn't his. It was theirs. The schism didn't erupt. It unfolded, quietly, irrevocably. The Council didn't blink. But the Empire did, and as the dropships lifted into a sky now lit by truth, Ae'laa's gaze never wavered. She hadn't just survived, she'd changed the shape of what it meant to be. Velari. The Council convened behind sealed glass, but the light from the altar had already spread beyond containment. It was no longer a matter of evidence. It was a matter of belief. A compromise emerged, not out of consensus but necessity. Ae'laa would not be punished. Restoration was off the table, but she could no longer remain among the core Velari enclaves. Her field was too powerful now, her presence too disruptive. A living contradiction, too real to suppress, too dangerous to normalize. They gave it a name. The Treaty of the Fractured Flame, a concession wrapped in diplomacy. She would leave, but she would not be alone. She had earned autonomy. Others could choose to follow. The Union path was to be classified, not banned. Velari society would not collapse overnight, but something deep in its foundations had cracked, and from that fracture, light was already beginning to pour through. She stood at the edge of the E platform, hair swept by alien wind, skin lit by a gentler fire. Her eyes found his without urgency. "I don't need you," she said. And he smiled, because he believed her. What had begun as desperation had become discipline. Ae'laa's neural field no longer surged with unchecked hunger. It pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat now, independent, stable. She had learned to regulate the craving, to master the flame he had sparked. She didn't reach for him to quiet the noise. She chose him because the silence wasn't empty anymore. He took her hand, not as treatment, not as anchor, not even as symbol, as companion, and for the first time the contact held no weight of obligation, only warmth. She had crossed the breach between cultural denial and personal desire, and on the other side she had not found addiction, she had found agency. Final observation report. Dr. Callen Rhys, classified archive. 9X7E, she was never broken. That's how he began, not with data sets or hormone charts, but with a declaration. The kind that could never pass peer review, but might someday change a civilization. Ae'laa Thyn was not corrupted by human touch. She was unveiled by it. He described her transformation as neither biological accident nor emotional dependency. It was a convergence, an unlocking of something buried in Velari evolution, reignited by contact and choice. He closed the file not with a warning, but an invitation. What if connection is not contamination? What if it's the missing variable? He didn't pretend to know what would happen next, but he knew the question could no longer be silenced. As the system confirmed upload, Callen leaned back, eyes fixed on the stars outside his window. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about what comes after her. They gathered in quiet corners now, young Velari, their fields dimmed for privacy, their eyes lit with a hunger their ancestors had forgotten how to name. They asked each other strange questions. What if we used to hold hands? What if silence was something we taught ourselves to survive, not something we were born into? What if desire is not disorder but direction? The council issued statements, revised protocols, warned against premature exposure to unregulated empathy vectors. But the questions didn't stop. They passed from mind to mind like sparks on dry grass. One trainee requested permission to conduct skin contact experiments with Terran gloves. Another asked if ancient melodies could be recreated with vocal cords instead of ambient tone fields. They weren't looking for defiance. They were looking for memory, a memory their own bodies were beginning to whisper. It was subtle now, just a question. But questions once asked rarely go unanswered. The Stellar Accord departed without ceremony. No crowd, no banners. Just two passengers and a flight path that curved into uncharted stars. Ae'laa stood at the observation bay, her field pulsing in low tones that matched the rhythm of the ship's heart. Callen stood beside her, quiet, steady, not as a guardian, but as an equal. They weren't running anymore. They were searching for others like her, for fragments of history buried in exile colonies, for bloodlines where the spark might lie dormant, waiting. For questions even the archive had not dared answer. The stars ahead didn't promise safety, but they promised something else. Possibility. They were no longer anomaly and analyst, not symptom and cure. They were something new, something hybrid. Something brave. Somewhere among the black others waited, others who had dreamed of hands but never known why. And as the map dissolved into signal noise and dark, Ae'laa reached for his hand, not in need, in purpose. It came encoded in an irregular pulse, buried in a maintenance ping from a remote station orbiting Velari, a forgotten moon choked in frost and methane haze. The technicians almost dismissed. Sad, but a junior analyst decrypted the waveform and isolated the anomaly. An emotional resonance spike. Origin Velari. Subject age 13, no Terran contact. The spike matched Ae'laa's post-contact pattern. No touch, no human proximity, no artificial stimulation. The spark had appeared on its own. The system flagged it as a genetic aberration. The field scientist flagged it as the impossible. Message was transmitted across a secure channel to the Stellar Accord, and deep within the ship's neural archive, Ae'laa's field flared in response. Just once. It was beginning again. She didn't say anything at first, just stood still, reading. The data, her field flickering between caution and something far more dangerous, hope. She turned to Callen slowly, face unreadable. Then she smiled, not the smile of a woman who believed she was unique, the smile of someone who realized she was never alone. She wasn't the first. She was the first remembered, and that changed everything. Callen watched the stars stretch into filaments across the viewing bay, a tapestry of riddles and half-forgotten truths. Behind him, the data pulsed again, another resonance match. Then another, not anomalies, not glitches, echoes. He whispered to no one in particular. Touch was never the miracle. The real miracle was the response. Across the console, the contact curve updated, its predictive model charting the probability of Velari neural reactivation across isolated colonies. The graph climbed 1.2%, 1.8%, 2.0%, not random, inevitable. The console blinked once, contact curve rising. 2.3%, a single line scrolled beneath it. Phase 1. Initiated. Across the galaxy, dormant instincts began to stir. Tiny pulses in the dark, minds trembling toward something they had no name for. Some would resist, some would deny, some would embrace, but the curve would rise. It already was. Ae'laa turned her head toward the stars and whispered a single word in ancient Velari, long suppressed, now reborn. It meant, begin again, and they did.